There is no doubt that Richard Dadd was a talented artist. Admitted to the prestigious Royal Academy of Art School in London, he seemed to have a great future ahead of him. But on a trip to Egypt in 1842, his mind started to unravel. And on his return to England, he brutally killed his father on a woodland walk and fled to the continent intent on doing the same to the Emperor of Austria. Welcome to Insane History. I'm Professor Graham Yorston, neuropsychiatrist, and today I'm exploring the extraordinary life of Richard Dadd, talented artist and murderous madman. Finding out why he believed his father had to die and what became of him after the terrible deed was done. Richard Dadd was born in 1817 in the naval dockyard town of Chatham. He showed early artistic talent and won a coveted place at the Royal Academy School, where he blossomed as an artist, winning prizes in architectural and figure drawing, even though he preferred painting landscapes and Shakespearean scenes. He was commissioned to do a series of illustrations for a book of ballads, and by his early 20s he was confident enough to form the Clique, a group of like-minded artists who rejected academic high art in favour of more naturalistic representations of everyday life. Meeting regularly to sketch, read radical poetry, and do whatever else affluent young men did in those days. Amongst his father's circle of friends was renowned Scottish artist David Roberts, who had recently returned from a trip to the Holy Land and Egypt. Knowing Richard to be a fine draftsman, Roberts recommended him to Sir Thomas Phillips, a Welsh businessman and politician who was planning his own grand tour of Europe and the Middle East and in need of someone to record his adventures. They travelled through Greece, Turkey, Syria, modern-day Israel, Jordan and into Egypt. Dadd wanted to capture everything: ancient ruins, castles, biblical sites, dark alleyways and colourful markets, the local people with their strange costumes and manners, the camels, the brigands and the children running after them in the streets. But Sir Thomas wanted to tick off the sites as quickly as possible and move on. Dadd complained that he couldn't sketch on horseback, and when they arrived at their camp or lodgings it was too dark. In one of his curiously cross-written letters to a friend he declared, "The excitement of these scenes is enough to trouble a weakened mind. I have lain down at night with my imagination so full of vagaries that I have really and truly doubted of my own sanity." The vagaries continued, and his mind was full of confusion. Some accounts suggest this happened suddenly as the party was travelling up the Nile by boat. In another version, told by Dadd himself to a visitor late in life, it all started after he spent 5 solid days and nights smoking a hookah with a group of old men and becoming convinced that the sound of the bubbling pipe was actually a form of communication through which he deciphered a message from the ancient Egyptian god Osiris. He began to suffer headaches and experienced 6 full days of nervous depression and was perplexed as to what had precipitated it. His behaviour became more erratic, and Sir Thomas was concerned that he had sunstroke. Making their way back through Italy, Dadd got worse. He became increasingly irritable, and any discussion about religion or politics seemed to offend him. In Rome, he felt an almost irresistible urge to attack the Pope, but was dissuaded from doing so on seeing his guards. Dadd became more hostile and aggressive to his employer, and by the time they reached Paris in the spring of 1843, it was clear that his behaviour could no longer be blamed on the sun, and Sir Thomas advised him to seek medical attention. But Dadd mysteriously disappeared and returned to London. He shut himself away in his lodgings, subsisting on only new-laid eggs and ale, sketching and painting furiously. Rumours started spreading that he was going mad. His father realised he was not well and had him examined by leading mad doctor Alexander Sutherland, who recommended hospitalisation. However, Dad persuaded his father to go with him to the village of Cobham, just a few miles from Chatham, and somewhere he had sketched many times, explaining that he wanted to unburden his mind to him. On the 29th of August 1843, they set off together by steamboat to Gravesend, had dinner at a local inn, and at around 9 p.m. went out for a walk into the countryside. But the artist didn't want to talk. He didn't believe the man he was with was his father, but rather a demonic impostor. With a knife he had brought with him for the purpose, he launched his attack, first punching his father in the head, then attempting to slash his throat, and then finally stabbing him in the chest, twisting the blade in all directions. When the job was done, he raised his arms to the heavens and cried out, "Go and tell the great god Osiris that I have done the deed which is to set him free." The body was found at dawn the next day, and at first it was suspected that his son may also have been murdered by an unknown assailant. But the police soon found sketchbooks in his lodgings with pictures of his father and friends, all with their throats cut. By this time, Dad had managed to get on a boat to Calais, in such a hurry he hadn't even changed his blood-stained clothing. His next mission was to get to Vienna to kill Ferdinand I, the Emperor of Austria. But on a stagecoach racing through the forest of Fontainebleau towards Paris, he suddenly found a new mission. The conjunction of the stars instructed him to slit the throat of the man sitting opposite him. Somehow he was pulled off before he could complete his task and arrested. He immediately confessed to murdering his father and was sent to the asylum or Maison d'Aliénés at Clermont-sur-Oise. The chief physician certified that Dad was affected by a homicidal monomania, which he felt was due to excessive work, often at the expense of his sleep, unexpected disappointments, and a rather prolonged stay under the brilliant sky of the Levant. He said that Dad believed himself to be the son of the sun, which he spent almost the whole day staring at without blinking an eye. Inner voices urge him to put to death all the devils around him. These devils enter his body, and he is often furious because he is forced to spit them out. He sees them in his saliva. The asylum was keen on cold water baths, but despite its rather splendid hydrotherapy pavilion, Dad's delusions remained fixed and unshakable, and after 10 months he was transferred back to England. He didn't have a formal trial, but a brief hearing at Rochester Magistrates' Court ordered him to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, and on the 22nd of August 1844, almost exactly a day after his fateful walk with his father, he was sent to the criminal wing of the new Bethlehem Royal Hospital. Bethlehem Hospital was the same institution that had earned its dreadful reputation as Bedlam, with madmen held in filth and chains for paying voyeurs to gawp at. But attitudes to mental illness were changing, and the hospital had been rebuilt along more enlightened lines south of the Thames in 1815, in a building still in use today as the Imperial War Museum. One of the physicians at Bethlehem, Alexander Morrison, believed that it was possible to diagnose mental illness simply by observing a person's face. He taught that there were characteristic features that could be used to distinguish different disorders and warn of the approach of disease. He employed artists to sketch his patients, and it was when one of these told him about his famous charge that he permitted Dad access to painting materials. Morrison was impressed by his paintings and allowed him materials and facilities to continue painting despite Dad's not infrequent episodes of violence towards others. Reluctant to see visitors, Dad was generally forgotten about by the outside world, and when his pictures came up for sale, he was often referred to as the late Richard Dad. In 1852, William Hood took over as physician superintendent and immediately set about improving the physical environment of the hospital and expanding meaningful activities for patients. who had noted that despite Dad's delusions and erratic outbursts, he can be a very sensible and agreeable companion, and show in conversation a mind once well-educated and thoroughly informed in all the particulars of his profession, in which he still shines and would, it is thought, have preeminently excelled had circumstances not opposed. Dad's delusions were as fixed as they ever were. Whenever asked, he would repeat his belief that his father had been replaced by a demon, whom his real father, the god Osiris, had instructed him to kill. And how was his mental state reflected in his paintings? Perhaps surprisingly, the answer is not really at all. He painted his doctors and other staff, his fellow patients, and incredibly detailed fantasy worlds full of fairies and goblins. In the 1850s, he embarked on a series of 33 watercolours to illustrate the passions, including one for insanity. But he did not attempt to depict the Egyptian gods and demons that still occupied his thoughts. Yet despite his artistic productivity, he was still considered a violent and dangerous patient, for he would jump up and strike a violent blow without any aggravation and then beg pardon for the deed. In 1855, he began work on the incredibly detailed Fairy Feller's masterstroke, considered by some to be his finest painting. Dad worked on the painting for 9 years, but never finished it, as in 1864 he was transferred to a new facility, Broadmoor, Britain's first dedicated hospital for criminal lunatics. Richard Dad never left Broadmoor. In his 22 years inside its walls, he never expressed regret, never apologised for killing his father, and never lost his delusional conviction that his actions had been necessary. There were no effective treatments for psychosis at this time, and this is reflected in his progress notes, which stubbornly documented no change. And yet he continued to paint constantly and masterfully until he was physically unable to hold a brush. In January 1886 he passed away from an extensive disease of the lungs. He was 68 years old and had spent 42 of these locked up in an institution. Even death did not free him, as his body was interred in the Broadmoor Cemetery. He then fell into obscurity, becoming little more than a footnote in art history as a skillful fairy painter. Until, that is, Siegfried Sassoon, the First World War poet, who had had his own mental health problems, bequeathed the Fairy Feller's masterstrokes to the Tate Gallery in 1963. The appearance of Dad's painting in such a prestigious gallery led to renewed interest in his work and life. It was the era of anti-psychiatry, when the Victorian asylum system was being increasingly criticised, and his artistic accomplishments in this environment were seen as a triumph of the individual over the oppression of the total institution. Today, his works are on the walls of some of the world's greatest museums: the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Tate Britain, the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco, and the Scottish National Portrait Gallery, to name just a few. Deservedly so, for their artistic merits, not just because of his dramatic life story. For those interested in what modern diagnostic category he might fall into, I strongly disagree with those who suggest he had bipolar disorder. This assertion, I believe, reflects continuing stigma about the condition he really had, schizophrenia. The term wasn't invented until long after his death, of course, but a more typical case is hard to imagine. Schizophrenia remains a challenging illness to this day, but Richard Dad's life shows that people can still achieve amazing things, even with a serious mental illness. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the fascinating life of Richard Dad. Let me know your thoughts on any of the issues raised, and if you've enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel, where you'll find 100 or more other videos full of thought-provoking and intriguing content. If you'd like to find out more about Richard Dadd, I would say beware of some of the content that's on the internet, as there are some factual errors in that. There are 2 biographies available, but they're both out of print at the moment, but some second-hand copies are still available, and I've included the links to these on my Amazon store page. Don't forget to hit the notification bell to be kept up to date with the latest releases, and if you have any suggestions for new topics, I'd love to hear them. But apart from that, I'll say bye for now, and I'll see you again soon. Goodbye.